Was I trying to say Raymond and it came out Rain Man?
Ladies and gentlemen, step right up. Charlie finally got it. That Rain Man is Raymond. Good God. Took you long enough.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Cinema Psych podcast where psychology meets film. I am your host, Dr. Alex Swan, and today's film is going to be a little walk down memory lane. In this episode, we're going to be talking about Rain Man, an early-ish role for Tom Cruise. He gets second billing to Dustin Hoffman in this film. Came out in 1988. I say early-ish because, yeah, he was in other stuff earlier in the decade. But, you know, I consider it part of Tom Cruise's early career. The film was directed by Barry Levinson and written by Barry Morrow and Ronald Bass. One of the things that we are going to get into with this movie is the characterization of Raymond Babbitt, played by Dustin Hoffman, and probably one of his best acting performances ever. Even though Dustin Hoffman is a creepy old man, this was an extremely good character because he never wavers at all in the movie. He's like overacting almost. And then Tom Cruise plays his long lost younger brother, Charlie Babbitt. And so it's a story about these two brothers connecting and a change in maybe Tom Cruise's character Charlie on his future. We'll see. We'll definitely get into that because the vast majority of the episode, I think you know, if you've ever seen Rain Man, is the portrayal of Raymond Babbitt and the sort of characterization of autism in the film is probably what is the film's most famous idea. And according to Barry Morrow, who was the principal writer for the movie, the character came out of his meeting of Kim Peek, a real life savant, and then Bill Sachter, who was a good friend of Barry Morrow and was the subject of Bill, which was an earlier film that Barry Morrow wrote. And so it was an amalgamation of those two people. And without further ado, we're going to jump right in with our returning guest host. My guest host today is returning guest host, Dr. Anthony Zuccalillo. Welcome back to the show, Anthony.
Thank you very much for having me back, Alex. Pleasure to be back. Excited to talk some more movies with you.
Great. Yeah, me too. So, you know, just to get us warmed up a little bit, how's life been during the last time we spoke? Almost a year ago, I will say. It doesn't feel like that long, but almost a year ago. And I went back and looked. I was like, oh my gosh, it was almost a year ago. About a really interesting topic that seemingly hasn't gone away. We talked about, in your first episode, the movie Contagion. And that was just as the pandemic hit the U.S. So how you been since then?
Yeah, I mean, we knew it was prescient when we did that film, but it's kind of interesting to see, you know, here we are, you know, 10 months later, still dealing with, you know, the effects. we really, when we talked the last time, had no idea
Right.
exactly the course. But I mean, like most academics, I am adjusting on the fly with everything. Trying to keep my head above water. Down here in Texas, it's always a little confusing, the rationale for why things are open or why things aren't. So trying to be safe, but also trying to get out of the house a little bit. So, I mean, safe and sane, I guess would be my, where I am now.
Yeah.
Kind of looking forward and hoping that at least there is a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, that is good. That's a nice way to look at it. How has your teaching been in these past months?
Well, like most people, we switched to fully online for the March for the end of the spring semester, which was just north of disastrous.
Sure.
Most of us that were ready to go online were fine, but there were a lot of people who weren't. So those of us who were more adept at making that transition ended up pulling a lot of the weight.
Mm-hmm.
The fall was a little bit better, as we were talking about, mostly hybrid or high flex or whatever trendy higher ed words are being used.
Yeah.
So, at least having the opportunity to be present with some students and recording for those who needed the accommodations. It was a lot harder not having the discussions normally that I would. So it did kind of force me into some more lecture, heavy types of things, which I wasn't terribly fond of. But at the end of the semester, got the content covered. Feel like I delivered good classes. Students seemed relatively, okay. Grades were where they should have been. So by and large, most of the markers, where they should have been.
Well, that's good. I mean, that's good. And continuing at that this coming semester, that same model?
It's going to be the same model. We have, as I'm sure, most universities do, we have a plan in place. Should, rates rise, to a certain level.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody is very, very familiar with what it would look like now going online. So surprises. We are one of the universities that canceled spring break.
Yeah, we did as well. Womp womp.
Yep, exactly. So we're starting a week later, but it'll be a straight 15 weeks.
Yeah.
Kind of had mixed feelings about that. But
it's
we'll
nice to get the break. Sure. Yeah, indeed. It'll hopefully things improve to different proportions come the summertime when hopefully things get better. I don't want to dream too much, and I don't also want the episode to be too anachronistic. So
well, we did choose Contagion, so we were kind of asking for it.
Well, in that one, but in this particular episode, I don't want to make it too inaccurate. Yeah, exactly. One of the things that has happened over the course of the pandemic has been this. What do we do with films in online classes? So before we jump into this film, I just quickly wanted to get your strategy because I know you're a big user of film in your classes. What strategy have you done to get around the sort of in-person restrictions going on right now?
I've still been able to use a lot of film where I would, especially like those canned clips.
Sure.
They have, they're tried and true. The technology allows the, really decent streaming of it.
Yeah.
So, in that regard, I haven't really had to change. There certainly was a lack of film, sort of new films coming out to sort of bring into the content. Using full films was not something that I did this semester, which, wouldn't necessarily do it, but, occasionally, especially in general psych, depending on the vibe of the class, I did teach a summer film class, which was, in the planning before the pandemic.
Right.
That we did a little bit differently. Wasn't able to do group viewings to the same degree. So it was a lot of making them available through, media site or other streaming services. We did some Netflix parties,
nice.
Where appropriate.
Yeah.
But the community viewing aspect was not really there. And for a film class that really wasn't ideal.
I will say, on a slightly tangential note, about your Netflix watch party thing. So I think, Amazon and Twitch started this a little bit earlier than the other streaming, but I do have to applaud the big streaming services by recognizing that while we have to be apart from each other, we can still try to do things together and jumping in on that. I have not done either of them through the app, so I don't know how well they work, but not
bad.
Okay. You just have to have some other text medium, right?
Yeah. Okay. So there's no, there's no audio. So, you're watching the movie together. And then there's a chat box that occurs. So, again, not ideal. I don't know that I'd want audio there. And then it would kind of take on this Mystery Science Theater feel where everybody's sort of commenting randomly. That might not be the best thing.
Sure.
But and there are some limitations to that. I had students who didn't have Netflix. So, when we were doing a Netflix party, I had to have other films available for people to watch so that then when we got into class, we could discuss it. So there, were some limitations with that, but trying to leverage, some of that new technology and, what those streaming services were trying to do. And I was largely happy with it.
Yeah. Same. Okay, Anthony. Let's talk Rain Man. Okay. So, what about this movie would you say makes a good choice for the Cinema Psych podcast, this show?
Well, for me, there'll be a lot of, I'm assuming, our conversations about sort of the evolution of how we as a profession have understood autism and autism spectrum disorder over the last 20-something years. But one of the things that, really resonated when we were talking about this title was its influence on the zeitgeist, its influence on people's perceptions of, at that time, very, poorly understood disorder, and raising it to, the awareness of people, that was a cultural phenomenon, back in 1988, right?
Yep.
88?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So, went from a disorder that was relatively obscure to something that was, again, on everybody's, on everybody's radar, and I think that's what really makes this a really, really interesting topic, because looking at how film can influence people's behaviors, people's attitudes, I think that's prime material for this podcast.
And I love to tell a story.
He's artistic.
No, he's autistic.
And it was initiated.
I'm not familiar with that. What is the exact nature of the
St.
problem?
Joseph, Missouri.
He lives in a world of his own.
And the purpose
I'm
of
sorry,
it was to
but what's
speed up
wrong
the
with
movement
him?
of mail. It was a problem getting the mail from the East Coast.
Raymond, do a little
to the West
of your
Coast
what's on
in the
first.
intervening
Who's on
settlements
first?
we
What's
had.
on second?
Huh?
And they set out a initial program where a Ponies Express would ride for approximately 20 miles as fast as.
Well, what am I supposed to do? There's got to be something that I can do here.
Well, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I do know that his brain doesn't work like other people. And what he does isn't intended to be annoying. If he's getting on your nerves, you just take a break. Spend some time away from him.
Sure, I'll just send him back.
Sorry?
Nothing. It's inside jokes. You're telling me I just have to deal with this stuff. Is that it? I just got to deal with this stuff.
Yeah, that's about it. Out of curiosity, does he have any special abilities?
I mean, he's got a pretty good memory. He can counts toothpicks.
Huh?
Toothpicks. They spilled a box of toothpicks on the floor, and they took one look at him and knew exactly how many there were, and he counted them in seconds.
Ray. Raymond,
Yeah?
are you good with numbers?
Yeah.
I read about this. I want to try something here.
K-Mart, 400 Oak Street.
What'd I tell you after this, Ray? After this.
Ray, can we try something?
Yeah.
Do you know how much 312 times 123 is?
38376.
He's right.
What?
He's right.
He's right?
Yeah. Ray, how much is 4,343 times 1,234?
5359262.
He's a genius.
He's right.
He's a genius.
Ray, do you know how much the square root of 2,130 is?
46.15192304. 2304.
That's amazing. I mean, that is amazing. He should work for NASA or something like that.
If you had $1 and you spent 50 cents, how much money would you have left?
And you know, and I do have a personal sort of connection to this topic, only because when I started out as a young, newly graduated bachelor's degree in psychology, thinking that I could get a job, that might pay something. One of my first jobs was working within the social services system, working with individuals with autism. And so it's been a personal sort of topic for me for, my entire professional career.
Sure.
So I was really, really happy when we were discussing what films to do, and this one kind of came up because I have a lot to say about it.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Well, we're going to jump right into it. So the first thing, Anthony, if you will, tell our listeners what exactly we want to talk about with respect to autism. Maybe describe what autism is, what autism spectrum disorder is, give a little bit of history about the disorder in real life, and then we'll start by, and then from there we'll use that as a diving board into the film's portrayal.
Sure. So the current nomenclature is autism spectrum disorder, and it has been since 2013. And what autism spectrum disorder really did was it collapsed four previous categories into a single disorder. The two that most people are aware of was autistic disorder and Asperger's syndrome. And I think Asperger's will come up quite a bit in this because when we talk about media portrayal of autism, more often than not, we're talking about people who fell in that diagnosis.
Okay.
And then there was childhood disintegrative disorder and pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. So those were fairly rare.
Gotcha.
It collapsed the categories. And again, the biggest one being previously social impairment and deficits in language and communication were viewed as two separate elements.
Okay.
And in the new spectrum disorder, those two have been collapsed.
Okay.
And so deficits in social communication and language
Okay.
are a sort of singular touch point to look at.
Okay.
The repetitive and restricted behaviors, sort of that physical thing that a lot of people associate with autism, that hasn't changed.
Gotcha.
And even though autism has been in the literature for the better part of a century, it really wasn't until 1980 that it gained a diagnosis in the DSM. Prior to that, the word autism was only used in relation to childhood schizophrenia.
And that's interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah. And so a lot of the theories prior to the 80s had to do with very sort of Freudian ideas of why it was these children were showing these sets of symptoms. And so, terms like refrigerator mother, were very, very popular in the early, or in the middle part of the century in describing, this disorder as if it was something that was learned, in the early parts of childhood. Obviously, we've learned now it's a developmental disorder and it's genetic. And clearly it's not because of cold, impersonal, mothering that causes children to behave in this way.
Yeah.
So yeah, its roots in infantile, or what was referred to as infantile autism,
Okay.
was sort of the earliest connection. But in 1980, again, DSM-3, autism appeared as a diagnosis, but it still wasn't really fully realized. It was in 87 when autistic disorder became part of the DSM-3, and I think that was a 3R.
Yeah.
Kind of challenging my former clinical background here, but I mean, the interesting part about that probably is that the idea of autistic disorder as a diagnosable condition was right before the release of this film. And so one of the reasons why most people had not heard of autistic disorder, and even those who knew or heard of it didn't know much about it, it wasn't written about all that often because, there were no standards, diagnostic criteria. So in the literature, it was very, very hard, for people to talk about something that was just kind of talked about vaguely.
Oh, okay. And then the label of savant syndrome, did people know about that too? I know, I know. Currently, savant syndrome is a sort of pseudoscientific idea, but it's still talked about with I want to say relative stoneness as to consider it a fact around this time and with respect to this movie. So, what about savant syndrome?
So I don't know as much about that, and actually was finding conflicting pieces of information on it. I do believe sort of the public belief of it is way more solidified than what the science says. I've seen numbers anywhere between 1 in 10 individuals with autism that also has savant syndrome to 1 in 200.
Okay.
Those are radically different numbers.
Yeah.
The important thing, though, that I took away sort of from, again, my personal understanding, professional understanding, and sort of the research that I did was it is separate. Savant syndrome does occur and sometimes occurs more frequently in other diagnoses other than autism. But we can say with some certainty that it is linked to autism because of Rain Man.
Okay.
And so when we think about the public's perception, oftentimes those savant skills are part of people's basic understanding of it. And it's really, when you look at what are the cultural representations, and I hope we do have some time to talk about other better portrayals of autism.
Sure.
Autistic spectrum disorder, excuse me. I still have a problem sometimes referring it to its current name. So forgive me when I screw that up.
Me too.
But I do think that a lot of people, like, they hear about autism. It's like, oh, Rain Man.
Yeah.
And so all of the things associated with Raymond Babbitt become part of what people believe is true. And again, I think that goes back to your original question about why is this film so good for this podcast? Well, we see a really, really long-lasting effect of a piece of popular culture that still influences people's perceptions, even 20 or 32 years later, right? Did my math? 32 years later, when we know a whole lot more, but yet Rain Man is still most people's cultural touch point.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. We're going to take a quick break and jump right back into it. Stay with us. Hey, listener. Thanks for sticking around this episode. I hope you're enjoying it. Anyway, I need your help in growing this podcast's audience. In past episodes, I've asked you to share this podcast with 5 of your friends. Let's keep doing that. Share this podcast on social media, especially if you really liked an episode. Share that episode. Tell 5 of your friends or family if they have an interest in film or psychology, or even better, both. Growing the audience is our goal for the second year of programming, and so we need your help to get that done. Other ways to contribute to the podcast include tips to our PayPal, found on our website, becoming a patron at patreon.com/cinemapsychpod, rocking some sweet merch from our Spreadshirt shop, and or leaving us a rating or review on your favorite podcast service. Now back to the show. So let's pivot then now to Raymond Babbitt, the character. So based on what you just described about ASD and the sort of history of it, and then now we're going to be using our current lens to view Raymond Babbitt's character, even though in 1988 it wasn't necessarily the same. So describe for us what situation Raymond is and what that portrayal, or I should say, well, let's just get to brass tacks. How is the portrayal?
So I overall, I would call it poor, but I wouldn't say that it wasn't without some elements that I think were good.
Okay.
I think it starts off on a very, very bad note. This idea of him in an institution.
Okay.
Which would not have been that uncommon earlier in the century. By about that time, generally speaking, from what we know about Raymond, he was probably high enough functioning that he probably didn't need to be in an institution. Now, albeit that we get some indication that, mom dies, dad, not necessarily the caretaker. And then, a little bit later on, during the buddy movie part of Rain Man, we kind of learned that there was an incident where he might have drawn a bath for Charlie that was a little too hot.
Rain Man?
Yeah.
I said Rain Man?
Yeah, funny Rain Man.
Was I trying to say Raymond and it came out Rain Man?
Yeah, funny Rain Man.
You? You're the Rain Man? Who took this picture?
Ph.D.
And you lived with this?
Yeah, 10961 Beachcrest Street, Cincinnati, Ohio.
When did you leave?
January 21st, 1965.
You remember that?
It's Thursday, very snowy out. 7.2 inches of snow that day.
Geez, that's just after Mom died, New Year's.
Yeah, Mom died January 5th, 1965.
And you remember that day? You remember that day that you left?
Short and sudden illness.
You remember that day that you left?
Yeah.
Was I there? Where was I?
You were in the window. You waved to me. Bye-bye, Rain Man. Bye-bye, Rain Man.
So you were the one that sang to me?
Yeah.
What did you sing? What was that song? What did you sing? What?
She was just 17. And you know what I mean. And the way she looked was way beyond compare.
So how could I
dance with another? Ooh, I saw her standing there.
Did I like it when you sang to me?
Yeah.
Do we sing any other songs? You like the Beatles?
Yeah.
Scary! Oh, it's a scary band! Scary band! Oh, it's a scary big band!
What's scary? What's scary band?
Hot water, baby! Water!
Hot water burn baby? What baby? Me?
Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Easy.
Water.
Ray.
Hot water.
Easy,
Hot water.
easy, Ray.
Burn, baby.
I'm not burned.
Yeah.
Ray, look at me, please.
Water burn,
Ray,
baby.
please.
Hot water.
I'm not burned.
Hot burn, baby.
I'm not burned, man.
Not burned, baby.
I'm not burned.
Yeah.
I'm not burned. It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's okay.
And so, you know, we can see why, you know, in that situation, they might, might take Raymond and put him in an institution.
Mm-hmm.
But he is relatively high functioning. Even as we see him, when we look at it through a modern day lens, there is no way that Raymond would be in any kind of institution today.
Mm-hmm.
He would be perfectly capable of living with far less supervision, at worst a group home, but more likely than not an independent apartment that had some staff assistance.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that rubs me wrong about that is you are automatically taking a disorder and contextualizing it as individuals who are institutionalized.
Mm-hmm.
And then they marry that with the, just Raymond and his savant skills becoming a focal point of the film, which is probably the thing that I like the least about it, because it's had the most cultural, it's lasted the longest in our culture. People don't remember, things about, his rocking motions, which, from what I understand, he, at least was in contact with several individuals who, did have autism and mirrored some of his mannerisms from, those individuals. So, the scenes, especially where I see him rocking, or the, some of the scenes with a lack of eye contact, and certainly the muted emotional tones.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are relatively accurate, both in what I understand the disorder to be from a clinical perspective, as well as my experience with individuals. But I unfortunately, I feel like those subtleties get lost in this film. And you remember things like counting cards in Las Vegas, or him freaking out with the toaster oven when he sets off the smoke alarm. Those are the things that I think people remember about this film, which, ultimately, sort of shifts my view about it.
Okay, yeah. And I 100% agree that the things that get remembered most are the more quote unquote zany aspects, the things that make the entertainment hit harder, I suppose. From a purely entertainment standpoint, a purely cynical entertainment standpoint, the things that make you go, huh? So I'm referring to somewhat to the toothpick scene where they're in the diner and they have to go after Charlie takes a phone call from, I think it's the head of the institution, or the doctor at the institution where Raymond was, and they have to go, but Raymond wanted some toothpicks, and so he tries to open the box, and they all fall out, and he says there are 246 toothpicks on the floor, and the waitress, the server, who I believe is Bonnie Hunt. It looks. It is. It is. Oh my god!
Hunt, yes.
I did not remember that, but
I IMDb that as soon as I saw it. I'm like, that looks like Bonnie Hunt, and it was.
She says to Charlie as he turns to go that there are only 4 left in a box of 250, and it's like, how do you did you count all of them on the floor? Because there was the first number he gave, it was like 88 or something like that.
Yeah.
And then how do you know how many toothpicks are in the box? Like, it's one or the other. Amazing feat. And that's the kind of stuff that sticks. That's the kind of stuff that sticks with the viewer, because it's like, whoa, I can't do that. I can't add 3 numbers together at the same time. 1 plus 1 plus 2 plus, I don't know. Like, we all seem super dumb by not being able to do that kind of thing, but but there are lots of people who are like this in the history of psychology. I talked about super memorists at the very end of this past semester with my memory class. And whereas, I would firmly place Raymond in his capacity is just better, but there's a little bit of technique in there too. Like he spends a lot of time doing these kinds of things. He spends a lot of time with puzzles that have like numbers inherently embedded within them. So yeah, something is different on the brain level and giving him the ability to focus on that information, but then this like massive amount of technique that put him in the far end of the memory curve, and then that's what we focus on because we think it's about a movie about what are they called, human calculators.
Yeah, human calculators. Yep. Yeah. And I mean, we see that, and I think that this, it had been a while since I had seen this film. So certainly welcome the opportunity to go back and revisit it, wondering what my opinion might be of it. And, it really was, if we wanted to look at this film, it really was kind of lazy in its screenwriting. Like
I said at the top of the show, I mean, the screenwriting, I will grant you lazy, but I did say at the top of the show, I think it's a well done film and it's a well acted film for sure.
I do too. Yeah, no, I do too. But I think that that it was very formulaic. I mean, it's really just a real basic take on the buddy movie, told in 3 acts, everything foreshadows something else. And so, but those are the moments of the film that I do think people would remember, and maybe not necessarily in the beginning when Charlie first meets Raymond, when he's spouting, some of the baseball facts, but then later on with the phone book, and he gives him the phone book to read and he memorizes, A through G or whatever, over the course of one evening.
Right. Half of G.
And then, and then the scene in the small town doctors, where he was, demonstrating his mental math ability. And then ultimately the scene where he's just throwing cards out on the roof of the car or on the hood of the car. And Raymond's able to say, well, these are this is the hand that you have left, which obviously is the driving thing to make them turn around and go back to Las Vegas.
Right.
So, I agree. I do think that there are some great acting performances in this. I do think that, overall it's an enjoyable film from an entertainment perspective, but I do think that it is structured in a way that creates those moments that when you think about them, they're going to leave a weird and or bad impression of what you just saw.
Yeah.
And so if this was a movie, if we were talking about, is this a good representation of savant, syndrome? Sure. Of course it is. We know that most savants, their skills are related at least in some way to memory. There's, not a lot that I've read about it, but, when you talk about, things like rapid calculation.
And the person that Raymond was based on, Kim Peek, and Kim Peek being a human calculator.
Yep. And also, a rapid absorber of, knowledge. I think I read somewhere, that, towards the end of his life, he could answer almost any question about 10 to 12,000 books that he had read, over the course of his lifetime. So not only was he able to read apparently at a increased speed, but his retention was, nearly, photographic or not photographic, but like basically
flawless.
Every word. Yeah. Flawless. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of like Solomon Shereshevsky, S. Oliver Sacks is S. Yeah. Similar, but I mean, for S, it was synesthesia that was the major driver of his abilities, and he was miserable He was miserable. He said later in his life that like he couldn't do the simplest of things, and it was very troublesome.
Right.
So go ahead.
No. I'm good. Go ahead.
So I wanted to pivot here to because there I think we can continue the discussion by incorporating the sharing segment, and I normally pre-record sharing segments and give shout-outs to folks that I've asked for their input on a particular film, but I thought this particular episode might benefit from having a live sharing segment, and Anthony can help me out. We are both members of the Facebook group for the Society for the Teaching of Psychology, STP, where I asked of our colleagues here what they thought about Rain Man, and what they would say about it if they were to talk about it in class. And I thought a lot of good discussions came up in this particular thread. It was very poppin', and I think that's because a lot of people think are very passionate about autism and representing the community in the most positive and realistic ways. So we did mention Kim Peek was the inspiration for the film, just as we said. And I think it's important to note that we need to make sure that we separate autism spectrum disorder from any sort of representation of savant syndrome. And I think it's very important to put a gigantic wedge in between those two. And one of the things that came up in the sharing segment from a lot of people is, I would say, what is one thing that we talked about right before we started recording, Anthony, which was, what are alternatives? If somebody wants to use a film for autism in their class, or a television show, or a some other literary work, what are your there were some recommendations dropped in this discussion, but what are your thoughts on that?
I'd be very, very curious to hear about what some of the other people's recommendations are. But as I said earlier, there is a lack of good representations, especially individuals who aren't on the higher end of the spectrum. So when we look at film or television shows, and there are two that in the recent past that I always think about, because those are the ones that students ask me about. One called The Good Doctor,
okay,
and the other one Atypical. I think Atypical was a Netflix series. Both of them were individuals who were on the higher end of the spectrum. Were individuals that would have been previously diagnosed with Asperger's.
Mm-hmm.
But now, what I'm hearing from students, is because it's autism spectrum disorder, they're a little bit more confused. And so now they see these portrayals of autism and, they're like, oh, well, in the case of The Good Doctor, he was a remarkable surgeon or whatever the heck. I couldn't watch it. It was unbearable for me to watch. But there are two things that I have used in the popular culture that I think are pretty decent. One is kind of odd. Since 2015, Sesame Street has had an autistic character named Julia.
Yes.
That I think more often than not is done very, very well.
Okay.
Really, in terms of the some of the restricted emotional connections and some of the even repetitive behaviors and things like that. I think they do a very tasteful job of it. The other book, and then it's been made into a play, it's called The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime.
Mm-hmm.
I think that does it has some of the same problems as Rain Man does, in some sensationalizing of some things that are not common in autism.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that book, more than the stage play, really, when I read it, I was like, this feels like I'm getting into this character, this Christopher character. And those are really, really quite good. The movie that I would tell people to watch is Adam, which was a 2009 film. And I always forget the, Hugh Dancy.
Hugh Dancy. Okay.
Who I'm not too sure based on other portrayals isn't on the spectrum himself, because he does the several characters in his filmography have, again, what we would have called Asperger's type of traits. I think Adam does a good job of at least that higher end. I don't know a really, really good media portrayal of the average person with autism. And if anybody, on that thread commented on it, I would love to hear what they said. Because most of the portrayals, like I said, are on the higher end.
Okay. Mary Miller suggested in the movie in Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity. So Mary suggests I'd have students read that before they watch that film, which would be great. But then she also brings up Temple Grandin. And now there's a documentary on Temple Grandin, but there's also a film that came out in 2010 that starred Claire Danes as Temple, and Temple wrote the screenplay because it was based on her book, Emergence. And so I've never seen it. I do remember some Academy Awards for Claire Danes or Temple's writing. I think Temple won, right? I'm pretty sure.
I've forgotten all about that, so I don't remember.
Oh, it was Golden Globe. Sorry, it was Golden Globe because it says it right here. But I don't know that one because I haven't specifically seen it. But I wonder, since it was written by Temple Grandin, a famous autistic scientist and humane livestock handling proponent. Right. If that would be an interesting one to show. But then there was also another suggestion, which I think you might recognize once it hits you. Let me find the post. Where did it go? Meredith Neville Boyd suggested What's Eating Gilbert Grape.
So I actually just saw that as I was kind of looking through. I don't know how I feel about that one because that's another one that I haven't seen in quite a while. Although oddly enough, I was clicking through channels recently and it was on, and I was and I was like, I haven't seen this in a while. So thinking back on it, it could be,
it's, she states that it's not explicitly described in the movie as such, but the symptoms acted by, what's his face? Leonardo DiCaprio. That's who I was thinking of. Yeah. Leonardo DiCaprio. Yeah. And his older brother, I think, is Johnny Depp, right?
Johnny Depp. Yep.
Yeah. So, so that's what she says. She says that the symptoms that are portrayed by Leo are more in line with what we know of ASD now, even though the movies did come out around the same time.
Yeah.
So those were the two suggestions that came out of that thread.
No, that could be. I would have to go back and look at that one, and I mean that might. If we looked at that one, it definitely might be a more typical portrayal of autism from my memory, and not one of these, individuals who are, whether they have a savant skill or on, the higher end of the spectrum. Temple Grandin is a really interesting one. I've seen many interviews with her. Mm-hmm. The documentary material I've seen, I would be very, very comfortable showing in class to show some of the, interpersonal communication, emotion types of parts of the disorder, as well as some of the repetitive behaviors. Mm-hmm. But you've got to balance that with, okay, this is somebody who was incredibly intelligent, incredibly accomplished. And so would we be sort of, giving the right, message with that? Because again, the overwhelming majority of individuals are not going to function at that level, certainly not going to, change a, field of agriculture, to that extent. And so I think it's a great story. It's a great inspiration. And like I said, I would feel very, very comfortable pointing to her book, the documentaries and interviews that I've seen. I don't know about the movie though, because especially the Julius Claire Danes portrayal. I've seen clips of it, looked pretty good, but never sat through it.
I gotcha. All right. A couple of other points that I wanted to pull out of this thread relate to things that are probably stuck with its time period, which I thought was interesting. That was brought up. So one of the things was that the film came out in 1988, so it was filmed either in 1988 or 1987, and there's some interesting historical aspects because it predated the Americans with Disabilities Act, because that was in the 1990s, I think, somewhere early 1990s, somewhere around there, and so there's some anachronistic tendencies to it. So it's a little stuck if you were to watch it now and be like, wait, they can't do that to them, or they can't do that to them, and they can't do that to them, because that's thinking without the ADA in mind, of course. And then so that was Nancy Davis Johnson that came in with that lovely bit of info. And then on a related note, it was Julie Weinstein mentioned that even now, that once people with autism turn 21, they lose services for that they were being provided with. And I don't know if that necessarily applies even in the case of this movie, because it sounded like the dad was loaded, and so it was just like an ongoing thing, like he's gonna pay and eventually, I don't know, he didn't have to pay anymore,
right? That is
reverse mortgage, here's my child.
Yeah, and I mean, clearly he had a big wad of cash, that he had left to the executor of the estate, which obviously is the driving conflict in the film,
right?
It's always that's a big thing. Is the schools, in terms of services that can be provided up until the age of 21, there's a lot of services, a lot of money, a lot of programs that are available, but then. When they turn 21, then the adult services are limited.
Okay.
And, those funding, sources are not as delineated. Clearly, there are things like, the federal health insurance, Medicaid, Medicare.
Right.
I always get confused which one, and certainly somebody who was severely disabled that needed, work support or living support, or, in the cases, even now, somebody who might need hospitalization or long-term inpatient care. There are, monies available. But I think a lot of the burden falls on families. Those services are not easy to access. The system is designed to be frustrating. I believe. I do think you see some parallels, obviously, if you have means, you're going to get the best level of care available.
Yeah.
That's one thing that, hasn't changed. If you have a mental illness, and you have means, you're going to find a private hospital that will cater to those needs. If you are paying out of pocket.
Yeah.
And clearly you get that idea that, Raymond probably was, he was being taken care of. He was in one of the best institutions.
Yeah.
So, clearly look, if somebody were to be, if somebody was watching that film in 1988 and they had a sibling or a family member that was in an institution, it probably did not look like Walbrook.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good point. That is a very good point. Yeah. Ooh, boy. That is, that's rough.
The state hospital system looks very, very different than the the private hospital system.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So, and we touched on a number of other of your thoughts. So Mitchell Metzler mentioned that Anthony talked about at the beginning of our discussion that savantism is exceedingly rare among people on the spectrum. Not just exceedingly rare, but specifically for people on the spectrum, and then you get those stereotypes that raise up. So and then just to round out this segment here, my apologies, Ayers wrote about the inherent ableism expressed in the film, about specifically Charlie's character, but then also the things that are made that Raymond is made to do for the sake of the story. So that's definitely ableism. Mm-hmm. And then Mel Frank mentioned the continuum of exceptionalism, right? So there's a little bit more philosophical, which I very much appreciated. Mel says that capitalistic societies are hinged on a significant portion of the economy sustained by citizenry that can produce these days, which is to consume. Given this, how would Rain Man evidence production or consumption? So how would a brother help Raymond identify his purpose, utility, agency throughout his lifespan? I thought it was a really deep set of questions. Yeah. And though the story is formulaic, as you said, Charlie has a bit of a redemption arc. And Raymond has a bit of a growth arc. The story beats are pretty similar. Charlie is a loathsome character at the beginning, and through his journey, the journey that he takes you on with him, you grow to, you quote unquote grow to allow Charlie to be graced by his better angels. And then you're like, oh, I sympathize with him. Oh, that poor dude. But in a sort of related context, the idea with Mel's questions here is that, is Raymond only useful to get Charlie out of a bind? Like you mentioned the one story part that sort of takes you out of this whole buddy cop journey. Buddy cop, I don't know why, best friend's journey. Yeah. Is the very selfish wraparound back to Las Vegas, and sort of another aspect of ableism, which is that you have some awesome skills but are deficit in so many. Don't worry about it. I'm going to make you a rich guy. Here's what you got to do. It was very self-serving, and I don't know why Charlie Babbitt earns redemption, because I don't see him as a redeeming person.
Yeah, I don't either. One of the, I mean, multiple problems with the whole Las Vegas part of the arc. Given everything that we've learned about Raymond, his reaction in the casino, or I should say lack of reaction, he's very calm. He is very focused. Pretty much, if you watch that movie, there's pretty much no indication that he would function that well in the casino, let alone, be able to pull that scam for, as long as he did. Right. Like you, I also have a very, very hard time forgiving Charlie. Mm-hmm. I do believe him, and I do believe that redemption arc is legit. I do think that he came to a, understanding. I did believe him when he said, he wished that he had known that he had a brother his entire life. So there were some genuine moments in there.
Fair.
When he, if really all he wanted to do was get himself out of, a bind, he could have taken that check, from Dr. Bruner for $250,000, probably could have bumped him up even a little bit more. He could have, had a nice little bit of money and gone on his life and not ever, look back. But, we are left to believe that 2 weeks after Raymond pulls away on that train that, Charlie is going to be flying back to, I don't even remember where that, where is that? Where, Pittsburgh or somewhere
on the East Coast?
Yeah, somewhere. Yeah. But we believe that he's going to be getting on a plane and going to visit Raymond. And so if that's what comes out of it, and, then, maybe there is, something deserved about that redemption. But I still don't like him, but I also don't like Tom Cruise. That's sort of a personal thing. So it's hard for me to yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for the Your Thoughts segment. Please keep those ideas and comments coming when you see those come around the STP page. Generally speaking is where I ask. Sometimes I ask on Twitter, sometimes I ask on my Facebook, or check the podcast Facebook SinsciPod, or Twitter at SinsciPod. Just, plugging the two services.
Got to get those social medias out there.
Exactly. I also want to thank Anthony for joining me to discuss Rain Man. Anthony, before we go, is there anything that you'd like to plug?
Well, I mean, right now I have a couple of things that I would categorize as in the fire, but like everything else in the past year, most of it is not, anytime soon coming. So I'm going to do what I did last time. I'm going to plug another excellent film podcast that I've had the opportunity since the last time I was on to be part of.
Nice.
It is called Beer and a Movie. And we actually did an episode back in September. They were doing everything virtually, and we actually did an episode on Charlie Kaufman.
Gotcha.
So I think your listeners who are interested in the intersection between psychology and film, we tackled the new Netflix film, I'm Thinking of Ending Things, as well as adaptation.
Yeah.
So you can look for that. But other than that, nothing really. Plug.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming by.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure. You just have to email me. I'll come up with some ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Solid. Okay. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Until the next one, thanks for listening.